Good morning. How is everybody? Miss Doherty, hey, class time. You turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. I should let Jerry get up here and preach this. He has a new take on Sermon on the Mount. It's good to see everybody. Hope you've had a good week. Been a busy week, sure, for all. Has been for the Dartys, but we're glad to be here and hope you are as well. Got a lot of folks out today, and so that means you need to sit in two seats. Everybody needs to sit in two seats so we can count you twice, okay? And so we have a lot of folks out. We knew would be out, and so we want to remember them in prayer with regards to their safety. Is there anything else we need to announce that's not on the announcement sheet? Bye-bye. All right, well, good. Good. All right. We have been studying questions out of the Bible, and we've looked at several Old Testament. We only want to do this for 13 weeks. There's a multitude of questions. Like I said at the very beginning, I came across a list that said didn't list them, but said there are 2,700 questions in the Bible. Now I don't know how if they said every question, they counted every question like that. But anyway, there are a lot of questions in the Bible, and a lot of them make good lessons, good stories, good things for us to think about and to understand. I want us to go from the Old Testament now to the New Testament. We've been studying for about 6 weeks from some Old Testament questions. I want us to study for a few weeks on some New Testament questions, and then we will get, as we announced back last Sunday night, we will go to the book of 1 Corinthians and study that. But we began in Matthew 5 today. This is where our question is. Matter of fact, it's in verse 47. But I want us to think about, and I want us to set the broader context, if you will, with regards to the New Testament and with regards to study the New Testament. We began, we open up our Bibles, the book of Matthew, and there we are. And we see the lineage of Jesus, the birth of Jesus. We see then the events with regards to John the Baptist and Jesus' temptation, and then we get to the Sermon on the Mount. Well, let's think about that for just a few minutes. Let's think about the fact that we don't have a lot of what you would call, per se, sermons from Jesus. Matthew records probably 5 sermons, depending upon, granted, how you look at them. But this being the first, this would have been in his Galilean ministry, which would have been early on in his ministry, somewhere around 28 AD, with him dying in AD 30. So if you want to say, well, he died in 33, then you're talking about AD 30, 31, depending on your chronology, if you will. So it's early in his ministry. It's his Galilean ministry. It's really, there are a few things that from a chronological standpoint, there's very few things that have happened. We know that the event in the temple where Jesus was confounding the wise men of his day. We know that he then, according to Luke chapter 2, verse 52, he grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and mankind, that he grew. And that's the key, that he grew. And then really the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, their accounts of the gospel. They all start at different places by virtue of the fact of what they're trying to impress as far as theme, who they are trying to impress from the standpoint of who they're writing to. And so consequently, we see different takes. But the early ministry of Jesus, we get to the Sermon on the Mount, and we notice several things. Notice, if you will, beginning in verse 1, seeing the multitude, he went up. This is chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 1. Seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. This was the normal way of teaching in biblical times. The preacher, the speaker, sat down, and the audience stood up. Now, a lot of that was due to reverence and respect for the message that was being delivered. But nevertheless, that was the tradition, the way of the time. We've changed. Now the speaker stands up and everybody else sits down. I don't know who thought of that. Probably some deacon somewhere thought of that somewhere along the line and just confounded everything. But nevertheless, Jesus begins in the Sermon on the Mount, and if you look at the sermon just from a standpoint of broad, not trying to get too specific yet, and you see really the Sermon on the Mount, the way I look at it, is Christianity through the eyes of Jesus. And he begins by the Beatitudes. He begins by talking about this is the attitude that you need to have. These are things with regards to characteristics, the traits that make up, in many ways, your overall beatitude. And so your attitude, excuse me. So he looks at the idea of here's what you need to be. Whether you need to be a humble individual, a meek individual, you need to be one that hungers and thirsts after righteousness, or you need to be a peaceful individual. Here's the attitude that you need to have. And then he goes from there, he talks about your influence, and he talks about Christianity, if you will, through the eyes of Jesus, and he looks at our influence and how that we're the light of the world and are light in the world, and we are to be the salt. And we are to influence those that we come in contact with. And then he spends probably, you might say, the rest of the time talking about righteousness. Talks about Christianity from the standpoint of this is how you live. This is how you live your life. And he begins in many ways as he begins in verse 17 of the 5th chapter, he says, do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And so he says, assuredly, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle by no means pass from the law, till all is fulfilled. He's hitting a group of people, if you will, as he begins to talk about, okay, here's how you live your life. He's beginning to hit a group of people that need to understand where he's coming from because they are coming from a Jewish perspective and a Jewish background. And he needs them to understand, I'm not coming to just turn everything upside down. It's sort of like this. You've probably, through the years, you've probably studied the Bible with someone, and they've said something to the effect, my mama believed, my grandmama believed. And the reality of it is mama and grandmama may have been wonderful people, may have been good church-going people, but may not have believed the Bible as it states it. And so consequently, they maybe have heard things themselves, and they have changed things, and things have become modified, and even in their own thinking. And so what do you have to do? You have to say, okay, I believe mama or grandmama, they were wonderful people. I believe that they did the very best that they knew how, the very best way that they could. And that would be true. But I think if they were to be able to talk to you today, they would say, do what you know is right. It's sort of like I read an old illustration, or not an old, but an illustration the other day. Is talking about somewhat this idea. And the author of the article was making the statement that, maybe in grandma's day, they didn't have flu shots. They didn't have pneumonia shots. But what would they tell you today, especially if they died of that? What would they tell you? They'd tell you, take a flu shot, take a pneumonia shot, take the shingle shot, whatever the doctor tells you to take. Why? But we've learned what we should do. And so in scriptures we learn. Well, this affects what we're fixing to look at in a few minutes. But to finish, if you will, Christianity through the eyes of Jesus, the last part of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus deals with our destiny. And so he deals with our attitude, he deals with our influence, he deals with how we are to live our life, and then he deals with ultimately our destiny. Let's get back to Matthew chapter 5. As we look at this text, Jesus, once again, is addressing these folks, and he's trying to address them from the standpoint of letting them see what he's all about. And as he does that, he continues in verse 19. He says, whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whosoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So there, if you think about what Jesus does, pretty close to the beginning of this sermon, is he says, listen and do what you're told to do. It's a theme that runs through the Bible, if you stop and think about it. Listen and do what you're told to do. Even if you want to just a comparison, think about Proverbs chapter 1. My son, hear the instruction of Father, forsake not the law of your mother. Listen to what you're being told and do it. Like I say, that's a theme that runs through the Bible. Why? Because that's what God has given to us. And I'd like to get further into that, but that would then spoil my sermon and you'd have to sleep through my sermon, and I want you to stay away. So just hang on and we'll do part 2 of that in the sermon. But as time goes on, things change. And things get changed. And as I see the rest, especially of the 5th chapter, Jesus begins by saying each little paragraph, you've heard, you've heard, you've heard. And as he tells them, he says, you've heard, but notice what he says, but I say unto you. This is what you've heard. But I want you to know this is the way it is. Now, Jesus, what did he say? Go back to verse 17 of the 5th chapter. He says, do not think that I have come to destroy, to take away, to do away with, to tear down the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but I came to fulfill. Beginning in verse 21, where Jesus begins these paragraphs, you've heard. What's happened is that folks have taken some of the old law and through the years, it's been modified a little bit. It's been changed. Whether it was changed on purpose or not, we do not know, but things got a little haywire, if you will, in people's thinking, and they changed. It's sort of like, do you remember playing the old gossip game? You know, you had the teacher would line up all the students, and at the first student, the teacher would whisper something like, you know, you have beautiful hair. And by the time it got to the end, it was something like, Billy's a scroungy old dog. You know, it's just completely different from what it was in the beginning. Well, through the years, especially because while, yes, the law was written, much of it was handed from family to family orally. Not all of it. You say, preacher, wasn't the Old Testament wasn't? Yes, it was. Qumran scrolls would definitely tell us, the discovery would definitely tell us that it was, but that's not the point. The point is that not every family had one. They didn't have the Bible like we have it. We can thank a lot of folks for the Bible the way we have it, but nevertheless, things got changed. And so Jesus is trying to straighten out, if you will, a few of the misconceptions, as he would say, you've heard, but I say unto you. I want you to jump down now to verse 43. Now, he talks about several things, if you will. He talks about adultery. He talks about murder begins in the heart. And he talks about marriage being sacred and forbidding of oath and going the second mile. But now he talks beginning in verse 43. He says, you've heard that it's been said, you love your neighbor and hate your enemy. There's going to be a twist on scriptures. Look, before we move further, look in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. Excuse me. In the old law, this is what God had given with regards to part of the law that the children of Israel were to follow. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now think about that. Now what does it say? Don't take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. That's important to hold on to. Because by the time you get to New Testament times, Jewish folks basically thought that their circle, if you will, of inner circle, their circle that they were to forgive was sort of an inner circle of family and a few friends and close relatives. Yesterday, Suzanne and I had the pleasure of going to my great nephew's first birthday. So in other words, I got to see both my nieces, their husbands and children, and to see my sister and brother-in-law. So it was a good day. And we thoroughly enjoyed celebrating the little fella's first birthday. But not only was there my two nieces, their husbands, their children, my sister, my brother-in-law, but there was what would be my niece's husband's part of his family, not all of them, but just a few members from his family. And I watched because we have been together before for their older daughter's birthday and a couple of other occasions. But I watched. We were as separate and apart as daylight and dark. They sat on one end of the table. We sat on the other. We got up. They sat over here. We sat over there. It's not that we don't like each other. We don't know each other real well. I know one of the well, he would be an in-law even at that, wouldn't he? Yeah, I know one. And so he and I talked for a little while. But this is the way the Jews thought. You know, I have me and mine, my kin, and that's it. And everybody else they would consider an enemy. And so when Jesus said, when they looked at the old law, they said, we fulfill it. Why? Because look in Leviticus 19. Again, look at what it says. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. Sure to love your neighbor. Now, Jesus is going to stretch this a little bit. And go back to verse 44 of Matthew 5. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. He says, now this is what you've heard, but this is the way you're going to live your life from now on. This is the way if you're going to be a follower of me. This is the way if you're going to be a disciple of mine. This is the way that if you're going to be, if you will, what we would call today a New Testament Christian, you're going to live your life. Well, how are you going to live your life? You're going to love your enemies. You're going to love your enemies, and you're going to love those that do terrible things to you. Not easy, is it? Jesus never said it was easy. But he says, do good to those that hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. God's a good God. God is fair and equal to all. God doesn't show sides. God doesn't show privilege. Have I shared with you the story of the man who married Millie and she died, and then he married Tilly? And so she died. Well, when Millie, his first wife, passed away, he had her buried. And then there was a space left, and on what would be the other side of him was buried Tilly. His instructions to the funeral director were simply this: when I die, bury me between Millie and Tilly. They were both wonderful wives, but tilt me a little bit towards Millie. Now, you know, it's hard to show favoritism, not to show favoritism. Suzanne and I, we've seen mothers and fathers that have shown favoritism. And I think Suzanne would agree with me. My wife didn't. I mean, my mother didn't, and my father didn't. The only thing I got more, and you've heard me say this, the only thing I got more than what Carol got was I got more spankings than Carol got. And my mother said before she died, she said, "You deserved more." Well, thank you, Mom. I appreciate that. But nevertheless, it's hard not to. But Jesus is saying we're going to live our life like God. And God shows no favoritism. For if you love those, verse 46, who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? He says, for if you love those who love you, what reward have you? See, there's a great question, isn't it? If you only love the people that love you, and admittedly, it's hard sometimes to love everybody. And I had a man once look at me straight in the face boldly and proclaim, I got to love you because God tells me to, but I don't have to like you. There's no difference, really. And I tried to explain that to him in a very kind and loving way. And he went away, I think, then not even loving me when I got through. But nevertheless, notice what Jesus says. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? In other words, those people that you don't like, remember the tax collectors, those people that you look down upon, those people you have no respect for. He says, those folks, they do that. They don't like but anybody but the ones that like them. That shouldn't be. And verse 47, if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? Now there's really the question for the day. He says, if you greet just your brothers, and he said, that's all you greet, your little circle of friends. He says, he asks this great question. Do not even the tax collectors do the same? But he says, what do you more than others? Now, like I say, that's our question. And I know I want to say this for a minute. I got to thinking about this as I was studying this week. I know that in some of these questions, we have taken a long time to work our way up to the question. And part of the reason that I've been doing that is because I hope that you'll go home then this week and you'll go study the Sermon on the Mount. So now you've got a pretty good feel for the Sermon on the Mount. And so if you spend this week studying Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you've got a pretty good feel for what's going on. But the question, he says, what do you do more than others? That's the question for the day. What do you do more than others? Well, as Christians, we have a responsibility. It's challenging. I think it is difficult. I don't think it's impossible. The challenge is simply this. Let your light shine before men. That's your challenge. To be as the Lord would be. To be as he told us to be, but to be as he is. As Christians, not just today, we can go back through time. And one of the great challenges that Christians have had is to be different. We don't like to be different. The only person I know in the world that likes to be different is Jerry Barber. And I can say that because Jerry's here. I mean, who runs through the neighborhood looking like a stop sign but Jerry Barber, right? We love Jerry. Jerry knows I'm picking on him, and he's laughing, so we're laughing with him and not at him. And I wouldn't say that if he wasn't here. It always tickles me that, especially kids. Do you remember when young people went through the Gothic phase? They all dressed in black and wore makeup and black lipstick and all this stuff, and they looked like they were dead. And I asked a young person once, I said, why are you dressed like that? Well, I want to be different. I said, how many kids in your school dress like that? Well, a bunch. Well, then you're not different. Oh, yeah. As Christians, though, we stand out not to be that sign that says, hey, look at me, I'm weird, I'm different. But to just be different because we're like Christ. To let that light shine. To be that influence. You see, it goes back in many ways to the idea of an influence. The salt and the light. As Christians, we're to do more than what the world expects. There was a sermon, I'm sure Jerry probably preached it, but it may have come from Jerry, but it was the idea of and then some. Do a little bit more, do a little bit extra than what you're called upon to do. Well, that's the question. And that's, when you think about it, that's really what God expects. Our faith is a little bit better. It's a little bit different, but it's a little bit better than the world's. Now, we say that not with a haughty spirit. We say that not with the idea of saying, oh, look at me and look how wonderful I am. We say that because we're called to it. Look in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. I just want to begin in verse 1. The thought that I really want to capture begins in verse 5, but let's go on. And Paul, in writing to the church at Colossae, gives them an understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And he tells them this whole book of Colossians is written with the idea of the superiority or supremacy of Jesus Christ. And he says, if you then were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth, for you died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Therefore, now here's where we want to start. Put to death. Notice what he says. Therefore, he gives a calling, if you will, verses 1 through 4. Gives a calling. Here's what you're supposed to do. I'm calling you to do this. Well, what are you calling us to do? Put the Lord first. He died for you. Therefore, you take his life and you hide it in yours. And so, therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth: fornication, uncleanliness, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, nor circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythians, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. Now, you look at that passage, and admittedly, you might say, well, there's a lot of negative in that passage. And we are a time frame and a society that likes the positive. Well, just think about the antithesis of all of those. Don't put on anger or what? Put on happiness. Put away from you wrath, malice, and blasphemy. What do? Well, you learn to live life a whole lot easier, a whole lot simpler. You go through that list and you just look at the opposite. But notice what he says. He's called upon those in Colossae. Live your life special. Now, once again, not as haughty, not as look at me, but when you look at me, see Jesus. And so do I more than the world. You see, one of the things that we do in life is try to get by on the minimum. I remember so well, and yes, it's been many years ago, but I remember so well sitting in class, high school and in college, and somebody in the back corner would be called upon by the teacher because I suppose their hand would be raised. And here would be the question. Is that going to be on the test? In other words, I don't need to know it. I don't want to read it. I don't want to study. I don't want to look at it unless it's going to be on the test. Well, that's not what the question implies in our question for the day of Matthew 5. It's not, can you do the minimum and get by? But how much can you do? Oh, well, let's just do a sidelight here for just a minute. Preacher, you know what that means and what that is implying? What's that? That you're working your way into heaven. No, I'm not working my way into heaven. The Bible talks about, Titus chapter 3, maintaining good works. And Peter would address the idea of we're special people, peculiar people. Remember the old King James use. We're to show forth the praises of him who called us out of darkness, we're told, into a marvelous light. We're to show forth. As Christians, we're doing what we're told to do. We're not earning our salvation. We're not meriting our salvation. We're following what God has expected of us. And so we live our life differently. But we live it with the idea of and then some. Something somebody'd like to say or ask before we look at a second idea. If you go back to Matthew chapter 5 for a minute. One of the things that Jesus talks about, especially if you look in verse, say, 21, he begins to talk about murder. And the idea of anger as well is tied in with that. While we understand that killing is wrong, right? I mean, I don't think anybody in this building says, hey, killing's a great idea. Now, we may have told our children when they were growing up, I don't want to, but we really didn't. Well, the Christian understands that killing's wrong, but he goes a little bit further. Look in 1 John 3, verse 15. In 1 John 3, verse 15, he says, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. Now, see, that begs the question. We know that murder is wrong. We wouldn't bring a gun in here for the purpose of killing somebody. We wouldn't take our gun. And if you own guns, I'm not talking about it, whether you should own guns or not. That's not what I'm talking about. But we wouldn't take our gun and go to a house tomorrow and kill somebody. Why? Because we say that's wrong. But Jesus, or rather John says in 1 John 3, you got to think about it a little bit deeper. He says, we know you don't murder. But he says, what about hating your brother? Don't hate either. What do? We go a little bit further. We not only are going out and brandishing a gun with the idea of killing people because we don't like them, but he goes on to tell us in 1 John 3 and then 1 John 4 what we're to do. What's that? Love your brother. What are you doing more than the world? Not just not killing, but loving. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? But what do we do as Christians? Romans 12 says we live peaceably with all men. And if you look at that text in Romans 12 where he talks about living peaceably with all men, I want you to consider something. That text does not say live peaceably with only those that are willing to live peaceably with you. He says live peaceably with all men. Now, if you go on in Matthew and you find out in the limited commission when he sent the apostles out for a very short period of time in a very small area, that one of the things he told them is that they went into a city and it would not hear the gospel. What were they to do? Go to the gates and do what? shake the dust off your feet and move on to the next town. Sometimes we have to learn to do that. Why? That's the Christian way. That's the way Christ would do it. What do you more than others? How about the idea of selfishness? Oh, really? The Lord doesn't want me to be selfish, does he? No. Sometimes we are. Remember what Paul said in Philippians 2, if you're there, if you have your Bibles, Philippians 2. He says in verse 4, look not on your own interest, but also in the interest of others. Don't be concerned just with yourself, but be concerned about others. When I think about selfishness, I think about a little old fellow by the name of Justin Carr. Justin Carr is married now and has 2 children. One on the way, that's what it is. One and one on the way. All right. Yeah, he has one and one on the way. And his sister is married and she has one and one on the way too. Yeah, that's right. Cheryl's going to be double grandmother here pretty quick. But anyway, it was when I lived in Mayfield, Kentucky, and I just called Justin's name because he'll probably never hear this. And even if he does, I want him to know how proud I am of him. But he's a little fella. He was a scrappy little fella. He was just a kid when we were there in Mayfield, but he was a scrappy little fella. And Justin, because he was scrappy, he probably sometimes got a little picked on at times. But we were having a devotional for the young people after church, and I think I remember whose house it was, but I'm not sure. But anyway, they had not ordered enough pizza for all the children that had come. And so they had turned around and they had ordered some, but they'd had enough in the first shipment, if you will. They'd had enough come that all the kids could get a piece of pizza, and then they would have more for everybody. They'd have plenty for everybody. And I remember Justin going through the line, and David Stark was in front of him. David's in Louisville. I think he's in Louisville. He's an engineer. But anyway, Justin decided he wanted 2 pieces of pizza. And David turned around to him and said, you're just supposed to get one. Hey, if I don't get it now, I won't get any. And so he got 2 pieces of pizza, and us adults, we just, yeah, whatever. Here, you want mine? That's the way we live our lives, even as adults. Hey, what about me? And Paul says, don't look on your own interests. Don't be selfish. Do a little more. Look on the interest of others, and then some. And so, here's the thought that I want you to leave with. I want you to leave with, first of all, an understanding of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, we find the standard. We find the standard for all of us. Peter says, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. As Christians, we're called to be like Christ. Yesterday, I told you that Suzanne and I went to see my great nephew's first birthday. We were looking at the children and looking at trying to figure out, who they look like. That's a favorite pastime when you get children and grandchildren, is who they look like. And I'm not so sure that my nephew-in-law is not a brother from another mother at a different age, because he's got looks that look a whole lot like my mama. And so consequently, their oldest daughter, who really looks like him, looks like my mama when she was a little girl. I think really she looks more like my sister, so therefore that kind of tells you where it goes through. But we looked at the little boy, Rhett, yesterday, and I think he looks like my niece, his mama. Well, my sister, who had already informed me of this, pulls out a picture of my brother-in-law when he was about that age and says, no, he looks like his granddaddy. And I said, yeah, but think about it. Who does Andrea look like? Well, I said, she looks like her daddy. And then she said, well, everybody says that, but I just don't see it. And I said, I wanted to say, well, get your cataracts removed and open up your eyeballs and see. Children look like parents, grandparents, genetics. Our genetics as Christians is to be like Christ. Christ left us an example that you should follow in his steps. But here's what we do a lot of times. We compare. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 12. We often compare. I shared with you this story before, but it so fits here. It's a story of man, I won't tell you where, congregation that I was with at the time, but I was sitting in a meeting with elders and deacons, and one of the things that came up was a concern with contribution. Now, we were doing well as a congregation, but you always want to grow. Steve's numbers, he always compares last year versus this year. To really show growth, it really doesn't show you where you are financially, it just shows growth or decline. That's really what that shows. Nevertheless, we were looking at it at this congregation, and I was pleased because, like I say, we were doing well. And anyways, the elders were discussing it. Deacon, who's treasurer, speaks up. He said, well, I guess wife and I, we could give a little more. He said, been giving in accordance. Yes, now he knew that because he was the treasurer. So he knew how much everybody was giving if they were giving by check. Now, he had a really good job and she had a really good job. But he was giving in accordance to what everybody else gave. That's not what the text says. 1 Corinthians 16 says, give as you've what? Prospered. Not as your neighbor prospered. So, I was young at the time and wasn't brash enough to ask this question, but I should have asked him, what do you more than others? What we often do is compare, and Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. In other words, don't look at your life and say, well, I'm better than so and so. You know why? What's the problem with that, or the difficulty with that? We usually find the weakest link to compare ourselves to. We look for the individual that's not as good for whatever reason in areas that we think we're good in, and then we compare ourselves. Man, we're great. Ooh, look at me. And Paul says, don't do that, because you have to ask yourself, what do you do more than others? Well, we have to be sure that Jesus is our standard for our life. That Jesus is the standard by which we live our life, we conduct our lives, so that others don't see us. They see Jesus. And so we began by asking ourselves the question, what do you more than others? Anything else anybody like to say? You can't believe I got finished early, right? Well, like I said, the plan is, and so let me just encourage you, we'll go another 5, well, let me just put it this way. We're going through the end of April, looking at questions, and now we'll look at some questions from the New Testament. And we will come back to this idea of biblical questions. We will come back to it sometime in the future. Remember, we try to do text and then topics and text and topics. Talking to the elders this past week in my evaluation, part of my evaluation was that they appreciated that. They thought you enjoyed that, and they wanted me to keep doing that. And so that's their plan and my plan as well, is to keep doing that. So we will start then. We will go through 1 Corinthians, and that may take us a little while, but I don't want to drag our feet. I'm bad about that. I know when we get into text, but I want us to kind of move. And so I know what you're going to say. Well, Paul, it all depends upon you. And you're right. And so I'll try to keep it moving. But go on and study 1 Corinthians, and that'll give you a leg up on what we're going to be doing before, 1st of May. And that'll be here before you know it. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our most kind and gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we're indeed thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessing of it and for the opportunity that we have to study your word. We're mindful of those that are sick, and we're also mindful of those of our number that are traveling, and we ask that you be with all of them and you bless them and keep them. We're thankful for the study of your word and be reminded of the fact, what do we do more than others? That we may always be busily engaged in working for you and with you so that others see you. Help our lives truly to be a light in our communities. We ask that you be with us as we go into this worship service, that we will truly worship you in spirit and in truth. Watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.